So Gary was told not to touch learning and teaching, and he did. And I was told not to touch post-digital, and I will, because there's the kind of disruptive and critical people we are. But thank you so much, Gary, for that really deep and kind of thoughtful starting point, and giving me the very difficult task of following that up with some thoughts about digital capability and about teaching and learning specifically. I think what I understand post to mean in the post-digital and some of the other posts that Gary's talked about is a response to things, a response to the digital. Whether we understand the digital to be kind of the sort of technical, scientific, material ideas behind the technologies, whether we understand it to be the reframing of the whole economy around a digital means of production, or more, as Gary has said, whether we understand it to be about the digital media and communications and how they've been radically changed as well. But in what I want to say, I want to privilege a critical response. Now, I understand that critical is a term that is right in the liberal humanist canon, so I will say a little bit about why I think that it's a useful place to start for my purposes, which is talking to academics largely about how they work with students and how they would like to work with students around digital. But I think I want to point out that from the very beginning of thinking about what it might mean for students to be digitally able in relation to those radical changes, it has had a critical kind of an inflection to it. So right back in 2005, Kahn and Kellner's kind of classic text around this, around techno-literacies, talked about how they had to be reflective. So thinking about our own media and our use of them and our own ideas and how our own ideas are reflected through and with the digital, and it has to be critical. And what they meant by critical was something to do with an awareness of our own assumptions, the political, social and educational assumptions around the digital. Now, I'm interested to think that back in 2005, 2008, when we were getting together previously, we could have pointed to those assumptions probably quite clearly. There was assumptions about progress, that the digital was going to be emancipatory, that it was going to create more opportunities. And it may be that you want to reflect about what those assumptions look like now. They're certainly more mixed. Some of the assumptions around digital are really quite dystopian. So, as you can see, I did anticipate the liberal humanist critique of criticality, which I think is entirely justified. So, the idea of the Western University is of the critical, autonomous individual who is motivated to understand knowledge for its own sake. And this is what many of our universities are founded on, our teaching traditions, certainly our assessment traditions, and post-humanists and feminists like myself and post-colonialists would critique that as saying it's very narrow, it's a very culturally specific idea of what knowledge practice should be. But I think there are all sorts of other critiques and actually challenges to the critical coming forward. Universities as seats of critical thinking are under attack from anti-liberal, anti-humanist forces that would particularly like the humanities and social sciences to shut up about some of the things we talk about. I think there are attacks from what we might call a neoliberal discourse of knowledge, in which knowledge for its own sake is really very outdated. We should think about what knowledge can do for us. So in relation to the digital, the OECD has a measure of students' capacity to problem solve in technology-rich environments. And it's a very instrumental idea of what it means to be digitally capable. And criticality itself has that very broad spectrum within it. Everything from a kind of instrumental toolkit, which is how critical thinking is taught in the US, to a kind of Freirean critical pedagogy, which is about changing yourself through changing the world. So criticality itself, I think, is quite broad. But the question I'm interested in particularly is whether criticality in all of those guises can really survive the challenge of technologies where data flows are pervasive and continual, where worlds are immersive, where information is quite depthless, quite live, quite open to re-editing and remixing. What pressure does the digital put on criticality, just as much as what pressure can critical thinking put on digitality as a series of effects in our lives? And what I really like about post-digital is whether it comes from artistic and musical practice. And in artistic and musical practice, it's very much about re-engaging, questioning media. And I think teaching, in its creative guise, is very much like that. Teaching is a creative conversation with materials. It's a collaborative labour with students, with materials, to create new things, for new things to happen. And in terms of artistic practice, I think the post-digital is a really exciting space to put teaching into. I've got a quote from the conference and from Gary here about the dichotomies no longer being useful categories. I think what I'd want to say, and I can see where we might go with the panel also though, is that we cannot, after the last 2 years, imagine that post-digital means we're done with technology. We don't need to think about that anymore, because the lived experience of teaching and learning has been absolutely that while there may be some convergence on the level of technology and theory between the material and the text and the online and the offline, making those modes of participation work in practice for people is a labour. It's a very difficult labour. Anyone here who's tried to teach high flex with people in the room and online will know just how difficult it is to converge the experiences of those modes of participation. So it can't mean we're done with technology and thinking about it. It can mean we're into a phase of understanding what the labour of bringing these different modes together looks like. And I also would just like to say that the other experience of the pandemic, teaching and learning, is very much that many parts of the world and many people in them are pre-digital in the sense that they would very much like to get their hands on some of these technologies and use them for their own advancement, their own empowerment, their own capacities in the world. So William Gibson famously said the future is here. The post-digital is clearly here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And there are some people for whom the world doesn't look at all digital at the moment. And those kind of divides have been exposed for us as teachers as something that we need to be aware of, the differences that students bring, not just in terms of access, actually. One of the most profound learnings of the pandemic, talking to teachers as I do, is the differences of learners' needs to be online, to be offline, the neurological differences, their social preferences, but also that even students that have apparently good access can have very different experiences of agency with the digital, can feel very differently about what it means to be online, how they're being judged and looked at online, what kinds of things they can say online. So this brings me to the third part of my critical post-digital capabilities, which is capabilities. Some of you will know that in the intervening time since I was last here, this digital capabilities framework that I helped to develop has become quite widely used in the UK and in other places. And I have quite mixed feelings about that because, as I do about anything that's sort of fixed, because we can't be fixed about what these things mean. But I do think the focus on agency, on students as agents, as becoming empowered, is why I like the term capability, because it really does focus less on skill, competence, as something that's owned by the individual, and more on how people develop in environments that are or are not supportive of their empowerment and their agency, expressing what they can do in a functional way. And I also like that, we put criticality there right at the beginning in terms of thinking about critical information and data use. So the rest of the time, I really want to talk about the research I've been doing in the last couple of years, which is around speaking with, I've spoken in depth with about 50 academics in diverse subject areas, deliberately very diverse, and will have spoken with, engaged with about 60 by the time I'm done, and also with specialists in digital capability, in digital media, and in criticality. My understanding from that is that criticality, as well as digital capability, has a huge variety of different meanings for different people, and that academic disciplinary culture is very significant, as well as organisational culture and national culture. But these are the questions that I kind of have gone in and spoken to people about. And the first is about criticality. So people have, different senses, as I indicated right at the beginning, of what it might mean in their subject to think critically, to be critical. It's a really useful start. It's a much more helpful starting place with academics to have scholarly, engaged conversations, frankly, than going in with digital, which is what I've been doing for many years of my career. Digital, you either love it or you loathe it. It looks like a thing. It often looks like a series of demands being made on me centrally in relation to my pedagogy and even in relation to my research and my epistemology. Every academic loves talking about their theory of knowledge, their epistemology, where they sit with their subject or their subdiscipline, and they love thinking about knowledge and how to communicate it. So coming in talking about criticality, I've found really exciting, productive. Okay, so how is digital media, particularly the kind of communication media, the changing nature of the book that Gary's talked about, the variety of media available, how is that changing what it means to be critical in terms of your discipline and how it understands itself, and in terms of how students come equipped or not equipped to be critical in ways that your subject discipline values? What new barriers might there be to your conception of criticality from the fact that these media are immersive, compulsive, attention-seeking, and all the other things that we might say about digital media. And that's about how the digital media and tools appear in the academic context, but of course also, what is academia doing to question, to critique, to query, to challenge and respond to these wider changes? What does your discipline offer in terms of a critical response to these changes happening in our society? They're kind of small questions, and I've had a huge amount of fun because people really want to talk about them. So I'm going to split the next bit into two. Hopefully I've got kind of a few minutes on each. One is those first three questions about what is it like to think critically with digital tools and media. And then I will just touch on, because I think it's useful to leave that thread hanging for later, what it means to think critically about digital tools and media from an academic perspective, from a perspective of how students are having their horizons perhaps expanded into a more critical context. So when I talk to academics, I was quite surprised to find that not that many of them spontaneously tell me that the things are terrible, the internet has rewired all their students' brains, as the popular press and The Guardian as well seems to think is going on. They're not that worried about students having very, very low attention spans, or blaming, if they are worried about students' capacity for extended reading, they tend to blame the curriculum pre-university and the curriculum in the early years of university, and not the internet. But of course, the internet is rewiring our brains, because we are tool-using creatures, people. Any tool, as Gary has said, any tool we use rewires how we think, as well as what we can think, as we use it. And so there's a lot of excitement around how we can help students to think differently using digital tools, as well as there are concerns about how students tend to fall into certain compulsive patterns of thinking around digital, which are not always helpful to the forms of criticality we, as within academic culture, changing though it is, may want to promote. And the first thing is really around excitements around the live nature of digital media as forms of academic expression, how students can annotate them actively, collaboratively, how they can curate content and how they can remix content. So I was reminded that one of the first, I don't know if you remember this, one of the very first browsers, Mosaic, was actually an annotation environment. Okay, yes, the older people in the room are nodding. So the idea was basically the whole of the internet in the 90s was imagined as being like Wikipedia. So you would want to make some notes, you'd want to tell everyone what your notes had been. That would be part of the richness of the internet entity. You would have an item that had been annotated, and you'd look at who else had annotated it and built on it. Died in about 1996. I think we can probably imagine why. There were alternative ideas of what the internet could be that were more powerful, Google and others. But other really nice tools have replaced it, like Hypothesis, which is something that I've used, and I've actually had my own work live annotated in Hypothesis, which is an interesting and challenging experience. And it allows students to really build that sense of knowledge as something contested, live, in my hands and open to use. And your own Yannicka Adema, I hope I've said her name right, at Coventry has published a really beautiful book called Living Books, which she has published as a series of live blog posts that people can actively go and engage with. And of course, that's something that students can do. So there's an excitement around the liveness of digital media, which creates new kinds of critical engagement that students can find really powerful. I think the second thing that a lot of people talk to me about is text, the difficulty of the fact that our assessment regimes are very, very text-based. So students have to engage with those heavy books, with those long arguments, whereas actually popular culture expresses lots of ideas, including high-value and intellectual ideas, in much more visual media. And so there are academics who are really experimenting with visual forms of argumentation, which I think also is really exciting. So how could we use design thinking, the user focus, the focus on a sort of spatialized rather than a narrativized kind of communication of ideas? How could that be something that we could bring into the classroom and allow students to really try out? And of course, one of the problems is, as academics, we're not very good at assessing that, because it's not, for most of us, how we tend to think. But we can become better at it, and we can work with our students to think of forms of argumentation that are not non-text based, but still require deep engagement with ideas and can be valued and assessed in that way. And in a related way, and I got this from the DMLL website, we can be thinking in kind of diverse media, not just different media, but media that are linked together in different ways, that give us choices, that can be translated into each other. Gunter Kress, who is kind of the guru of multimodality, talked about how once this choice is available of how shall I express this idea, we're in a new sort of idea. It's not just one idea we might translate in different ways. Kress, and I was lucky enough to work briefly with Gunter, and something I disagree with him about is his belief was that simply by creating in diverse media, students would come to understand those media critically. And one way this idea is very live at the moment is the idea of inoculation against fake news, that if you get students to do certain tasks where they try and create a viral meme that is fake, usually in a safe environment, that sort of inoculates them against misreading of messages. And I think, on the one hand, I think clearly we do learn a great deal about how media work by creating in those media. But I would also suggest what we don't learn much about is the business models and practices behind the mass production of those media, which also are a form of criticality that students might need to be exposed to in relation to some of these media. Computational thinking, lots of my academics wanted to tell me how important coding was or thought it might be, and they wanted to bring in academic tasks that involved a bit of coding, or in case of some subjects, I spoke to a mathematician who felt that the entire mathematics degree had actually been given over to a coding degree, and he was quite he spoke in quite an exciting way about that. I think coding, not everybody has to be able to code, but everybody surely to goodness has to understand what coding does and how powerful it is, and that if we're not programming something ourselves, our experience of the world, our understanding of the world is absolutely being directed by people who are. And understanding algorithms at that basic level is part of any kind of undergraduate experience, it seems to me. If we don't direct the technology, we're going to be directed by it. So data literacy, similarly, data is power, statistics is power. We need people who can code, who can work with data, but we also need people who understand what it can do to us. And some of that, as Gunter Kress would say, is about creating, coding, doing the data work, but some of it is understanding that broader context, what's happening with data. So there are two things that flow out from that in terms of the curriculum, and one is structuring for students varieties of critical activity with digital tools, understanding the choice of the tool, how the tool influences the task, structuring the task, thinking about the purposes of the task, using authentic digital data products where you can. And the other, which is not so often talked about, is thinking about the media that students are going to be expressing themselves in and the media that they're going to be encountering, and how their practices of coding and decoding, of translating, remixing, annotating are changing. You could call it digital study skills, except I would like to see that really embedded in every class and not something that's hived away for certain professionals who are very, very skilled, and I have talked to them and they understand this very deeply, but there's only a few of them and they're not deeply embedded in intellectual culture, sadly. So that was me talking about, in a sense, what the digital can offer in terms of criticality. And I'm not being celebratory. I think there are also, as I mentioned, there are also risks in terms of criticality and the compulsive nature of digital media and the way it manages our attention. But I'm not so convinced those are features of the media themselves as how they are sold, the business models around them, the attention business model. So then we come to what it might look like to expand that frame. So instead of just thinking about my students as needing certain skills, therefore I give them certain activities to do, needing to express their ideas, therefore I expose them to different media, how about that piece about thriving in this post-digital economy, society, democracy, just about, how do we think critically about digital tools and media in an academic context? And of course, just as with activities and media, the answers are very disciplinary. But this is where I think there can be a really interesting conversation across disciplines, because people are finding really exciting ways to open up that contextual frame around the activities students do to ask them to think bigger. And some of the things that they ask students to think about, and it can be as simple, and this is how I've often done it, and I'll show you right at the end the learning activities set that I use. Right at the end of an activity, there are some questions you can ask that just open this up a little bit for students about the technology they've just used, about the software they've just used, about the data they've just used, about what happens next to their products. History, how did this technology come to be in my hands? How was it made? There's kind of sustainability issues there, there's labour issues there, there's digital coloniality issues there. Where are these technologies made? How is the people's labour valued? There's a wonderful website called Follow the Things, maintained by a human geographer who I interviewed, that I would really encourage you to go and have a look at, which gets students to ask those questions about the digital products they have in their hands, both at the university but also in their private lives. And as I mentioned, the business model. A lot of the things we critique about digital media, if we go back to those heady days of the 90s when we thought the internet was going to be a creative commons for everybody, it's actually the business models that have emerged rather than the nature of the medium itself that often needs to be critiqued. So getting students to think beyond, where does this software come from and what job does it do for me, but actually, how is my attention being managed by this software and medium? Who is benefiting from that? Who's paying for it? Am I paying for it in the attention that I give to it, in the micro labour that I do, in the categorisation that I do, in the way my behaviour is being turned into data and sold to somebody else? Am I paying for it? Often true of platforms that are used in an academic context, for example. Equity. Who's here in this space? Who isn't here in this space? Whose voice is diminished in this space or finds it difficult to speak? Again, going back to student differences and how the online environment means something very different if you're from a group of people whose identity has often been under attack in open digital spaces. I think a lot of this comes down to power, doesn't it? And we're talking about empowering students in their lives all the time. But when we're talking about digital, power is not always visible. It can be hidden through the power that designers have to create the rules of engagement in an environment that you're in. Who creates the categories of the data that you're using? How and when did they appear? So power is kind of a very nebulous concept that we need to, I think, tie down to how it's actually enacted in the rules, the designs, the categories, the codes, the data flows. Where is power? Where is it happening? It's very difficult in a datafied world to understand that. And as I've suggested, that data flows is another way that students can begin to follow some of these issues, some of these really big issues, through the local activities they do with specific software, specific data sets, for example. And we started with history, so what about the futures? What consequences follow? So much of the digital environment is unintended consequences. And also, what alternatives are there? Thinking again about those narratives of digital as unproblematic progress, as liberal democracy around the world. Well, there are alternative narratives of the digital, and how might things be different is always a question. So just being a little specific, and I'm going to rush through these because they're kind of, I feel, obvious places to go, but the places that people I've spoken to have gone with this. The one that I haven't, this is very much work in progress, I'm still analysing all my data and collecting it, but the one I haven't put on here is sustainability, and a lot of my interviewees talked about sustainability as a wider frame they really wanted their students to engage with when they thought about digital, the kind of energy costs of blockchain and of AI, for example. But the platform, is there for everybody. If you're in a university, you are using multiple platforms. These are the platforms that Harvard University was using only and it's probably more now. I talk about the platform university in the sense that all our core practices, all the knowledge that we value, goes through the platform. The platform and the university are integrated. The value of the platform is provided by the university and the labour of staff and students in the university. The university itself cannot function without the platform. So, it's no longer the case that universities just buy these things in. When you buy a platform, you engage with a massive cloud-based system of data flows and of capital flows. And the university, every university, is a platform university. The platforms support and sustain the university, but of course those same platforms are being used to disrupt the university, including those liberal human ideas that we might hold dear, like criticality. They are disrupting the idea that education might be a place of deep critical engagement with knowledge, providing micro-credentials, providing opportunities to look at the world's best lecturer, have to go and listen to the one down the road, on TED or on the Khan Academy, and get a micro-credential towards what it is you think you want to do next. never mind education as self-development or self-enhancement or self-transformation or even world transformation. It's just a good that we can provide through our platform. I've mentioned the business models. These are some of the charts of how the EdTech business model has taken off in the last 2 years. Just massive amounts of financialization going into those platforms and that platform university context. I had Elon Musk on this slide before he tried to buy Twitter, but clearly there are actors in this space trying to disrupt how we communicate, who do not have criticality or even effective communication in their hearts when they engage. Algorithmic bias is another space that academics are beginning to step into to understand. If we want our students to use data and understand codes and algorithms, they need to understand where algorithms come from. This is a really nice project in South Africa where I've worked and spoken several times around coding, understanding that coding is power, as we said, but also understanding how algorithms, particularly if they're trained on biased data, the historic biases in our data sets, then they are inherently going to reflect the biases in human behaviour and assumptions. Joy Boylambini from the Algorithmic Justice League is someone who I follow and who has many wise things to say, not just about what's happening in the world, but how students can engage with that at a kind of activist and intellectual level, which leaves them feeling less disempowered. And, we've mentioned data, surveillance of workers, increasingly surveillance of academic labour, surveillance of students in the context of their campus. There's been pushback this year against Proctorio, for example, and other sort of exam systems. I don't want to single out a particular company because many companies have similar models of, that effectively breach students' privacy. But what we're talking about here is claiming human behaviour and making it into something else, making it into data which can be sold and used. And finally, all of this, what kind of futures are we educating our students for and are they aspiring to? The Director of Education at OECD very recently said that they were looking at ways of assessing AIs as educational actors. In other words, assessing AIs in the same way that the OECD assesses human beings within countries in order to see, as Andreas Schneider says, the things that's easy to automate, we should automate those, and then we should educate people to complement the things that we know we can automate. So that education should be about complementing the artificial, the things we can do well with algorithms and coding. There are other futures possible. This is not a done deal, just as there are other social futures possible. I love this picture of Mark Zuckerberg because I think it expresses what I said about power so clearly. Here is a room full of people who are wearing the headset, who are in the space. Who's the only person in the room who's not wearing the headset and who's smiling and making the money? That's how power works. And obviously, these immersive environments are becoming more and more compelling, more and more realistic, and more offered as places where you might actually live out whole parts of your life and carry out your labour and gain your value. So that is, I apologise, a whistle-stop tour through the many things that academics talk about when I suggest that there might be possibilities for widening the contextual frame when they're developing their students' digital capabilities. And I'm excited and they're excited. And so just to come back to where I started, so these suggest that the curriculum, you can see this is work in progress. It's such a terrible graphic, I apologise. It literally is out of the top of my head as I'm analysing my data. But as well as critical activities and thinking media, then academics start to think about contextualising. How can they bring in that broader perspective, whether it's historical, whether it's geographical, depending on the subject, whether it's cross-cultural, do we need to bring in another cultural perspective here? Whether it's interdisciplinary, would a different disciplinary perspective broaden the frame here? Is there a new narrative? Can we get students to tell different stories about what's possible in the future? And all of that requires, I'll finish on this, a relational space which is very safe because it's challenging. So criticality is also needs safe relational spaces for those challenges. Now, I'll put online so you can share it. I have collected up a lot of these critical activities I talked about in ways that are very shareable, and I make them openly available. So if you want to, I'll share probably the Trello board, which is the most usable. And I'll finish with the kind of challenge about criticality, which is, what assumptions about digital are you going to challenge in your curriculum or in your work with students? What assumptions are you going to challenge through those critical activities, through thinking differently about media and how it might be used for critical argument and engagement? How are you going to broaden the context for your students and the people you work with to be more critical? And I'll stop there.